On May the 18th, 1959, two United States Army officers stood on an endless white horizon in northwestern Greenland. Their aviator sunglasses reflected ice and snow in every direction. But Colonel John Keckering and Captain Thomas Evans weren't there to admire the scenery. They were planning something that would remain hidden from the world for nearly 4 decades. Within months, hundreds of engineers would arrive at this desolate location to begin construction on what would become known as Camp Century, a facility under the ice that would be celebrated as a triumph of American scientific research. But what the American public did not know, what was hidden from the Danish government, and what would shock the world when it was finally revealed in 1997, was that Camp Century was never really about science at all. The timing wasn't coincidental. 2 years earlier, on October the 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik into orbit, sending shockwaves through American military and political circles. The message was clear. Soviets had rockets capable of reaching space, which meant they had rockets capable of reaching anywhere on Earth. By 1959, the geopolitical chess game between the United States and the USSR had entered a new and terrifying phase, one where nuclear annihilation was no longer a distant possibility, but an everyday reality that military strategists had to plan around. The Arctic had suddenly become the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet, the shortest route between North America and the Soviet Union. Any missile launched from Soviet territory towards American cities would cross over the top of the world, and any American response would follow the same path in reverse. Greenland, technically a territory of Denmark but geographically positioned like a massive frozen aircraft carrier between continents, had already become home to Thule Air Base following a 1951 defense agreement. The base was part of the distant early warning line, a chain of radar stations designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers. But what the U.S. Army had in mind was something far more audacious, something that would push the boundaries of engineering, secrecy, and international diplomacy. The concept was simple in theory, but staggering in execution. Build an entire missile base underneath the Greenland ice sheet, a network of tunnels that could house 67 nuclear missiles capable of surviving a Soviet first strike and retaliating with devastating precision. The ice itself would be both camouflage and armor, hiding the missiles from Soviet reconnaissance while protecting them from attack. Mobile rail systems would constantly move the missiles to new positions, making it impossible for the enemy to target them. The entire operation would cover 52,000 square miles, roughly 3 times the size of Denmark itself, with an estimated 2,500 meters of tunnels snaking beneath the frozen surface. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems stacked on top of each other. Nobody actually knew if you could build something like this under the moving ice. The Greenland ice sheet isn't a static block of frozen water. It's a living, moving glacier that flows constantly under its own enormous weight. Nobody knew if people could live and work in such conditions for extended periods, or if the psychological toll of living in an underground ice fortress would make the whole operation impractical. And perhaps most critically, nobody wanted to tell the Danish government what they were really planning to do on Danish territory. Denmark was a NATO ally, but it was also a small country with a strong tradition of neutrality and a deep aversion to nuclear weapons on its soil. So, the U.S. Army came up with a cover story that was technically true but fundamentally misleading. They would build a smaller facility first, a prototype that would be publicly promoted as a scientific research station studying Arctic conditions and testing new construction techniques. They would invite journalists. They would publish papers. They would make it all look completely above board. Scientists would conduct legitimate research on ice cores, climate patterns, and survival techniques. And while those scientists conducted their work, U.S. Army engineers would be gathering the data they really needed, whether Project Iceworm, the secret mission to build an underground nuclear fortress, was actually possible. It was the kind of dual-purpose deception that the Cold War made routine, where science and military necessity existed in the same space. But only one was allowed to be visible to the public. The site selected for Camp Century was brutal, even by Arctic standards. Situated at an elevation of 6,600 feet on the Greenland ice sheet, the location experienced temperatures that could plummet to 70 degrees below zero. Wind speeds regularly exceeded 125 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that could last for days. Annual snowfall totaled more than 4 feet, constantly threatening to bury any surface structure. The first challenge was simply getting materials to the site. U.S. Army engineers built a road across the ice from Thule Air Base, a distance of 150 miles. They used massive sleds called heavy swings to transport 6,000 tons of equipment and supplies, and these sleds had a maximum speed of 2 miles per hour. That meant the journey from Thule to Camp Century took 70 hours in good weather. And good weather in northwestern Greenland was a relative concept. Convoys crawled across the ice sheet, each one loaded with everything from wooden building materials to steel arch supports to components of a nuclear reactor, all while exposed to conditions that could kill an unprotected person in minutes. Drivers worked in shifts, bundled in layers of Arctic gear, navigating by compass and dead reckoning across a landscape where everything looked identical in every direction. Once materials arrived, engineers faced the next challenge. How do you actually build underground in ice? The technique they developed was ingenious in its simplicity. Using specialized machines called piston bully plows, they would dig deep trenches into the compacted snow and ice, some more than 1,000 feet long. These trenches were then covered with curved steel arches and topped with several feet of snow for insulation. Inside the trenches, crews assembled prefabricated wooden buildings, making sure to leave airspace on all sides to minimize melting from the heat inside. The longest trench became Main Street, a subterranean avenue that would eventually house everything from sleeping quarters to a library, from laboratories to a barber shop. They even drilled down through the ice to create a well that provided 10,000 gallons of fresh water daily. A remarkable feat that solved one of the biggest logistical challenges of Arctic habitation. By October 1960, just 16 months after construction began, Camp Century was operational. The facility consisted of 21 interconnected tunnels spanning 9,800 feet, all of it carved into and covered by ice. It could house up to 200 people at a time, providing them with warm showers, hot meals, recreational facilities, and even a small theater for movie nights. The crown jewel was the PM-2A nuclear reactor, one of the first portable nuclear power plants ever built, generating 2 megawatts of electrical power and providing heat to the entire complex. The Army had done it. They had built a functioning city under the ice for about $8 million. A bargain by military standards. Now came the really hard part. Keeping the secret while figuring out if Project Iceworm could actually work. The public relations campaign for Camp Century was extensive and carefully orchestrated. The Saturday Evening Post ran a major feature in 1960, complete with glossy photographs and breathless descriptions of American ingenuity conquering the Arctic. Television crews filmed soldiers playing ping pong, scientists examining ice cores, and engineers confidently discussing construction techniques. National Geographic and other journalists wrote admiringly about the achievement. What none of these journalists knew, however, was that everything they were seeing was essentially a proof of concept for something far larger and far more militarily significant. Army planners were analyzing every aspect of the facility's performance, gathering data on ice movement, structural integrity, power generation, and logistics. The scientific research being conducted was real and valuable, particularly the ice core drilling that would provide climatologists with detailed records of ancient climate patterns. But it was also the perfect cover. In Denmark, the reaction was considerably more complicated. On August the 18th, 1959, at a cocktail party in Copenhagen, U.S. Ambassador Val Petersen informed Danish Foreign Minister Jens Otto Krag that plans for the American base in Greenland had moved on beyond the embassy's control. A diplomatic way of saying construction was already underway, whether Denmark liked it or not. Denmark had signed the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement, which allowed U.S. military facilities in Greenland to be built. But Denmark also had a strict policy against nuclear weapons on Danish territory. The Danish government's solution was to downplay the military aspects of Camp Century and emphasize its scientific mission. When Prime Minister H.C. Hansen briefed his government's Committee on Foreign Affairs in September 1959, he assured them that the project posed no political problems. This was, at best, an incomplete picture. What Hansen didn't tell most of his government was that he had privately agreed to allow the United States to store nuclear weapons at Thule Air Base, a decision that would have caused massive political upheaval if it had become public. The presence of Camp Century and its nuclear reactor was just one more secret in a growing web of nuclear secrets that Danish officials were keeping from their own people. It was a structure of cards destined to inevitably tumble. While Camp Century garnered acclaim in American media and was meticulously managed within Danish officialdom, the true endeavors of Project Iceworm unfolded discreetly within Army planning facilities. A classified 1960 Army report, bearing the title Strategic Value of the Greenland Ice Gap, delineated the full, astonishing scope of the military's aspirations. Utilizing Camp Century as a blueprint, Project Iceworm envisioned the excavation of 52,000 square miles of tunnels beneath the Greenland ice sheet, with potential expansion to 100,000 square miles. This entire subterranean network would surpass the size of Alabama, all concealed beneath hundreds of feet of frozen water. The plan stipulated the deployment of 600 Iceman missiles throughout this sprawling underground network, with launch emplacements situated every 4 miles along the tunnels. These were not ordinary missiles. They were specially modified versions of the Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile, engineered for extreme cold and equipped to breach the ice sheet overhead upon launch. Each Iceman missile possessed a range of 3,300 miles, sufficient to strike virtually any target within the Soviet Union from Greenland. The missiles were to be mounted on mobile rail systems, constantly traversing the tunnels to new locations, rendering them virtually undetectable to Soviet forces. Supporting this deployment would necessitate 60 launch control centers strategically positioned throughout the tunnel complex, each capable of independently directing multiple missiles. The entire undertaking would require approximately 11,000 soldiers residing full-time beneath the ice, a population comparable to a small city. The logistical hurdles were immense. How would one supply food to 11,000 individuals in the Arctic? How could morale be maintained when one's entire existence was confined to ice tunnels and ventilation systems? From a military standpoint, the strategic value was undeniable. Should the Soviet Union initiate a first strike against the United States, the missiles would remain secure, shielded by thousands of feet of ice and in perpetual motion, making them exceptionally difficult targets. The Army estimated that the Iceworm arsenal alone could obliterate roughly 80% of high-value targets in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. On paper, Project Iceworm represented precisely the kind of transformative strategic advantage that Cold War military planners envisioned. However, the Arctic was poised to present a starkly different reality. Issues began to manifest almost immediately. The first and most fundamental problem was the ice itself. Despite its appearance of solidity and permanence, the Greenland ice sheet is in a constant state of flux, flowing outward from its center like an exceedingly slow-moving glacier. Snow and ice, over time, behave as viscoelastic materials, meaning they deform and flow under their own immense weight. While engineers understood this in theory, the actual rate of deformation at Camp Century proved far more severe than their models had projected. The tunnel walls were continuously narrowing, bulging inward as the ice compressed. The ceilings were descending, necessitating ceaseless maintenance to avert collapse. By the middle of 1962, a mere 2 years after Camp Century achieved full operational status, the ceiling of the reactor room had sagged so drastically that engineers had to elevate it by 5 feet using hydraulic supports. 5 feet in 2 years. The implications for Project Iceworm's ambitious designs were devastating. If the prototype facility was already encountering structural difficulties after only 2 years, what fate awaited a tunnel network spanning 52,000 square miles, intended to function for decades? The Army's own geologists, analyzing ice core samples, discovered that the ice was moving at a much faster pace than anticipated. Within 3 years of excavation, the data indicated that glacier movement would result in the destruction of the tunnels and any launch stations within them in approximately 2 years. Furthermore, the technical challenges extended beyond ice dynamics. The Iceman missile itself was proving more complex to develop than initially foreseen. Adapting a Minuteman ICBM to operate in temperatures of 70 degrees below zero, buried beneath the ice and mounted on mobile rails, presented a formidable engineering challenge. The extreme cold impacted every aspect, from the missile's fuel and guidance systems to its electronic components. How does one maintain a nuclear missile in a state of readiness for immediate launch when encased in ice? How is it ensured that the launch mechanism can penetrate potentially hundreds of feet of ice overhead? Then there was the matter of obtaining Danish permission, which the Army had conspicuously avoided addressing directly. When Ambassador Peterson approached Prime Minister Hansen to discuss Iceworm, Hansen's response was intentionally evasive. He stated that since Peterson had not presented any concrete plans nor posed direct questions regarding the deployment of nuclear missiles, he was under no obligation to comment. The Army interpreted this non-response as a tacit approval to proceed with planning. This was an act of remarkable diplomatic wishful thinking, assuming silence signified consent when it truly meant, "Please do not compel me to provide an answer that would ignite a political crisis." By 1963, the writing was undeniably on the wall. The accumulating evidence from Camp Century made it unequivocally clear that Project Iceworm, as originally conceived, was unviable. The unstable ice conditions were insufficient to support such a massive permanent installation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, weighing the escalating technical difficulties against the enormous expenditure and the increasingly precarious diplomatic relations with Denmark, made the decision to formally cancel Project Iceworm in 1963, just 4 years after construction on Camp Century had commenced. However, the cancellation of Iceworm did not immediately signify the cessation of Camp Century itself. The facility continued to operate on a reduced scale, its role fundamentally transformed. Deprived of its missile deployment mission, Camp Century reverted to what it had consistently purported to be: a research station. Scientists there persevered in collecting ice cores that would prove invaluable for climatologists for decades to come. In late July of 1963, during a scheduled reactor shutdown for maintenance, the Army decided to operate Camp Century as a summer-only facility. The PM-2, a nuclear reactor, was never reactivated, and in 1964, the portable reactor was entirely removed. The facility struggled onward for 2 additional years, powered by diesel generators. The population dwindled from 200 soldiers and scientists to a minimal crew that arrived each summer. The tunnels continued to deform, requiring persistent work merely to maintain access to the site. The facility was evacuated in 1965, and in 1966, the U.S. Army made the final determination: Camp Century would be permanently abandoned. Any remaining equipment deemed salvageable was removed, but the vast majority of the infrastructure was left in place. This included wooden structures, steel supports, miles of electrical wiring, vehicles, machinery, and, most concerningly from a long-term perspective, substantial quantities of waste. The waste inventory was staggering. There were approximately 200,000 liters of diesel fuel still in storage tanks. There were 24 million liters of wastewater, including sewage, stored in tanks as the facility lacked any means of treatment or disposal. There were construction materials containing toxic substances like polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, commonly used in construction at the time, but now recognized as significant environmental hazards. And there was radioactive coolant from the nuclear reactor. While not a massive quantity in terms of radioactivity, it was sufficient to warrant concern should it ever leak. The Army's assumption, shared by the Danish government, was that all this waste would remain buried indefinitely under perpetually accumulating snow and ice. Each year, the Greenland ice sheet receives about 4 feet of new snowfall, which compacts into ice over time. The calculation was straightforward. The waste would be buried deeper and deeper, eventually crushed into nothingness over the ages. This seemed a reasonable proposition in 1966, long before the term global warming had even been coined. For nearly 3 decades, Camp Century and Project Iceworm remained one of the Cold War's most closely guarded secrets. The American public remained oblivious to the fact that this scientific research station served as a prototype for a massive underground nuclear missile base. The Danish public was unaware that their government had permitted such a facility on Danish territory. Even most Danish government officials were kept in the dark, privy only to vague outlines that Prime Minister Hansen and his inner circle chose to disseminate. The secrecy was so effectively maintained that upon the Cold War's conclusion in 1991, Most historians assumed that any classified projects would prove relatively unremarkable. Then, in January of 1995, everything shifted. The Danish Parliament commissioned an investigation by the Danish Institute for International Studies, known by its acronym DUPI. The investigation was prompted by new information regarding the 1968 Thule Air Base B-52 crash, where an American bomber carrying nuclear weapons had crashed near the base, dispersing radioactive contamination. The Danish government's prior statements concerning that incident had been contradicted by declassified documents, triggering a political crisis and raising questions about what else might have been concealed regarding American and nuclear activities in Greenland. As DUPI researchers delved into the newly declassified American documents obtained throughout 1996 and interviewed retired officials who were finally amenable to speaking, they unearthed something astonishing. The complete narrative of Project Iceworm unfolded in stages, with each revelation surpassing the last in its remarkable nature. The scientific research station had been, from its inception, a cover story for one of the most audacious military endeavors of the Cold War. When the DUPI report was released on January 17, 1997, the political repercussions in Denmark and Greenland were immediate and severe. Danish officials felt considerable anger towards their American counterparts, believing they had either been misled or, at the very least, deliberately kept in the dark to a degree that constituted deception. However, the more profound resentment was directed internally, specifically at the administration of Prime Minister Hansen. It emerged that Hansen and his inner circle were aware, or at least strongly suspected, the true nature of Camp Century. His carefully evasive replies to American diplomatic inquiries, his assurances to Parliament that no issues existed, and his emphasis on scientific research while minimizing military aspects all appeared in a different light when viewed retrospectively. This revelation was particularly galling for Greenlanders, where a burgeoning independence movement was already scrutinizing the country's relationship with Denmark and the presence of American military installations. Greenlanders felt that significant military projects impacting their territory should not have been sanctioned through vague diplomatic exchanges between Washington and Copenhagen, with minimal input from Greenland. The fact that the project involved nuclear weapons intensified these feelings. Yet, the most significant shock was yet to emerge, and it would not originate from classified documents. Instead, it would come from climate scientists studying the impact of global warming on the Greenland ice sheet. In 2016, a research team, spearheaded by climate scientist William Colgan, published a study that profoundly altered public perception of Camp Century. Employing climate models and meticulous analysis of ice accumulation and melting patterns, the team presented a startling projection. The portion of the Greenland ice sheet covering Camp Century was likely to shift from experiencing net snowfall to net melting by the year 2090. Following this transition, it was only a matter of time before the facility and all the waste left behind in 1966 would be exposed at the surface. Colgan's team had also mapped the extent of the waste, revealing sobering figures. The contaminated zone encompassed approximately 55 hectares, equivalent to roughly 100 football fields. All the diesel fuel, sewage, PCBs, and radioactive coolant that the Army had presumed would remain safely contained indefinitely were now on a trajectory to be released into the Arctic environment. The environmental repercussions were substantial, though precise quantification proved challenging. Meltwater was expected to carry diluted contaminants towards the coast, potentially impacting ecosystems along a 250-kilometer path. Arctic ecosystems are notably vulnerable to pollution, and substances like PCBs can bioaccumulate in the food chain. The more significant and immediately contentious question that ignited international debate was, who bears the responsibility for cleanup? The United States had constructed Camp Century and abandoned the waste. Denmark had granted permission for the facility and consented to its decommissioning. The waste was situated in Greenland, which had by then become a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. This raised the question, was this an American issue, a Danish problem, or a Greenlandic concern? The 2016 study precipitated a crisis in Danish-Greenlandic relations that overshadowed even the initial revelations concerning Project Iceworm. Greenland's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vitis Kujakits, expressed outrage at Denmark for not having taken more proactive measures to address the issue sooner. From the Greenlandic standpoint, Denmark had permitted a foreign power to establish a potentially hazardous facility in Greenland and then remained passive for decades. During this period, the facility gradually evolved into an environmental time bomb. The Danish government initially attempted to downplay the situation, citing other climate models that suggested the waste might actually be buried more deeply if snowfall increased. They contended that even if melting did occur, it would be gradual, and the contamination would be so diluted as to be effectively innocuous. However, the political pressure mounted relentlessly, leading Denmark in 2018 to announce the establishment of a camp-century climate monitoring program, overseen by the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. This program aimed to track conditions at the site, providing more precise data on whether the waste was being buried deeper or moving closer to the surface. While this marked a beginning, it left the fundamental issue of legal and financial responsibility unresolved. As of the present day, the United States government has not formally stated its position on whether it is liable for cleanup costs, which could potentially amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. However, the narrative of Project Iceworm and Camp Century continues to unfold even now. In April of 2024, NASA scientists, utilizing advanced radar technology, conducted a flight over northwestern Greenland. They captured a remarkably clear image of Camp Century, situated more than 100 feet beneath the ice surface. The radar was capable of differentiating individual structures within the former facility, revealing Main Street and the network of tunnels that remained intact despite decades of ice pressure. This image served as a stark reminder that Camp Century has not disappeared. It is merely dormant beneath the ice, awaiting the day when climate change will reawaken it. And when that day arrives, decades of Cold War waste will re-enter the environment, a final legacy of a project intended to remain secret and buried forever, but which has now become a symbol of how our pursuit of security can yield unintended consequences that outlast the very threats they were devised to counter.